Good morning. Welcome to CAC2's August all-member webinar. I'm Vicki Binger, president of CAC2. Today's webinar will be exploring childhood cancer and an initiative or set of initiatives around prevention. This is a very important topic, and I thank you all for being here today. I know that if you're like me, you have experienced the fatigue that comes with too much screen time and not enough time together. However, this webinar should seem like normal times as we continue to serve our members with the latest developments and expert information as we always have. If this is your first CAC2 webinar, welcome. If you've joined us before, welcome back. As you all know, today's focus is on the concept and issues around a broad-based community initiative focused on preventing childhood cancer. Before we get started, I'd like to remind you of a couple of other things that are going on. You can view last month's CAC2 Summit speaker program and the business meeting. You can also look at the other summer series in research and in advocacy and awareness on the new cac2.org website. Even if you don't want to look at those things, you should go to the new cac2.org website because it is fabulous. And I thank Jeremy Blyler and Julie Sutherland for making that as wonderful a resource for us as you can imagine. I'd like you to also please continue participating in the Family Support and Survivorship Summer Session, which is at noon Eastern, a week from tomorrow, August 27th. Also, as a reminder, if your membership has been due anytime in the last few months or in the next couple of months when there's been so many distractions, you can still go to the automated system at members.cac2.org for a safe and secure transaction. As always, send me an email at president@cac2.org if you have any difficulties at all. The last thing I want is for you to be frustrated when you're trying to do something as simple as renewing your membership. Additionally, I'd like to remind you of a few of our housekeeping notes. Right now, you are all on mute, and you'll stay on mute over the course of the time together. The presenters have agreed to take questions, and they would like you to defer the questions until the end. You can pose your question as you think of it in your webinar dashboard under questions. And if technology is a problem, just drop the question to me by email, and I'll make sure that it gets spoken. Robin, if you want to forward to the value slide, we'll just do what we do every time we come together, and that is make sure that people remember that the reason we do so well is that we put the children and their families first in everything we do. And we work to support our members and the childhood cancer community. We work to be accountable and cost-effective with resources, inclusive, collaborative. We give voice to the community and amplify it in a coordinated fashion as we stay action-oriented and flexible. I'd also like to thank this year's CAC2 Volunteers of the Year, Robin French from the Morgan Adams Foundation and Joanne Salcida, formerly of the Pediatric Brain Tumor Foundation, for the fine job they've done with the webinar series. And I'd also like to introduce individual member Ann Raymer, who has just joined the webinar team. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce my dear friend, Jonathan Agan from the Max Cure Foundation. Jonathan has an unflagging commitment to childhood cancer and to speeding progress through partnerships and collaboration. There's so many times where what I hear from Max Cure is that they're working with someone else. Jonathan's going to introduce our speakers today and help triage questions. And there are also two other CAC2 members, individual members, one of our newer members, Ann Robertson, and one of our longstanding and very active members, Mary Beth Collins. So Jonathan, I'm turning it over to you now. Thank you for being here and for pulling all this together.
Well, thank you, Vicki. I have to say that Mary Beth and Ann have been the driving force behind pulling this together. So, you know, this is a very exciting project that we're going to talk about, and initiative. And so, as we come upon September Childhood Cancer Awareness Month, it's really apropos that this initiative is shaping up and taking place. When I think about childhood cancer and the issues that make up the 360 degrees of the childhood cancer world. I often talk about and view it as like a bicycle wheel, and the hub or the center is where all of the spokes emanate from on that wheel, and the spokes represent the issues of childhood cancer. One of the spokes represents survivorship issues. Another spoke represents drug development, drug discovery. Another spoke would represent psychosocial support, and yet another representing the cure or survival. The spoke that we're going to talk about here is one that represents prevention, preventing childhood cancer. And you're going to hear a lot about that through the course of the hour, and hopefully it's going to spark interest in creating a movement and creating a collaboration that brings this issue out of the light. There's a graphic that's going to be put on the screen now. If Robin, if you could advance the slides. Those are our presenters. That would be me. Here we go. So the graphic on the screen represents a part of the story of childhood cancer, and it's rather troubling in many regards. So if you can see the yellow or gold line that represents the mortality rate, that's thankfully going down from 1975 till 2015, the end of the graphic. And this is for a significant number of childhood cancers. There have been a lot of success stories in terms of treatments and survivorship. Not for all the types of cancers, obviously, and that's a topic for a different webinar. But looking at the blue line, that's an increase in the incidence rates of children in the U.S. being diagnosed with cancer. Why? Why is this rising? Over the course of the remaining hour, the esteemed panelists are going to try and provide some answers to the question. You'll hear from two leading scientists, a parent advocate, Mary Beth, who is unflailing in her resolve, and you'll hear from Ann Robertson, who is an advocate and member of Max Cure's board, but is a significant driving force behind the scenes in the focus of childhood health. So what's this movement you're going to hear about? Well, it's an effort to focus on the issue of preventing childhood cancers, reducing the rising incidence rates of children being diagnosed, and thus eliminating the number of children impacted by childhood cancer overall. Prevention through the reduction of the effects of chemical and environmental impacts. This webinar is going to introduce the CAC2 community to an initiative that took shape over 2 years ago. One that was shaped in a highly unlikely manner, and you'll hear about that. An initiative that is one of the most important, if not the most important spokes on the wheel. One that can and should be discussed in the same breath as the cure. You'll have an opportunity at the end of the webinar to ask some questions, and then we'll share with you how we can all connect and move on from there. Every initiative has to have a solid foundation, and so for that, let me now introduce our first panelist, Margaret Kripke, a native of California. She received her bachelor's degree and master's degree in bacteriology and a doctorate in immunology from the University of California at Berkeley. Dr. Kripke holds appointments as Professor of Immunology and Vivian L. Smith Chair Emerita at the University of Texas MD Anderson Cancer Center and Professor Emerita at the UT Graduate School of Biomedical Sciences. She has authored more than 250 scientific publications and has received many awards for her research on UV-induced skin cancers and the effects of UV light on the immune system. She is a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science and the Academy of the American Association for Cancer Research. Dr. Kripke was founding chair of the Department of Immunology and subsequently served as executive vice president and chief academic officer at MD Anderson. She also served as a member of the President's Cancer Panel from 2003 to 2011 and chief scientific officer of the Cancer Prevention and Research Institute of Texas, known as CPRIT, from 2013 to 2016. That's just a very shortened bio sketch for Dr. Kripke. I could go on and on and on, but I want to maximize our time and maximize her ability to talk to everybody today. So thank you, Dr. Kripke.
Good morning, everyone. My task this morning is to tell you how I became interested in the issue of environmental causes of cancer and the importance of this subject for reducing the burden of cancer in children. Now, my main encounter with environmental causes of cancer came not so much from my career as a cancer researcher, but rather from my participation as a member of the President's Cancer Panel. Now, this is a 3-person panel appointed by the President of the United States, which is charged with informing the White House on the status of the war on cancer. And so each year, the panel selects a topic for study and prepares a report. So when I was a member of the panel, we decided to look at environmental carcinogenesis, or causes of cancer. And this was a somewhat difficult decision. There were a lot of negative aspects of this. One was that at the time, it was thought that only about 6% of human cancers were due to environmental causes. And I think that's still a view held by many people in the cancer research community today. This is a controversial subject. It's very emotional, it's politically charged, and so we thought it might be difficult to keep the focus on an objective analysis of what's really known and what's not known about things in the environment that cause cancer. And then there's some uncertainty about the field. There are conflicting evidence from one side and the other, and the kind of evidence brought forward about this issue is somewhat different than what we're used to as bench scientists. And so we were concerned about what conclusions would we be able to draw from looking at these studies, and what would be our message to the public at the end of the day. On the other hand, there were some positive reasons for doing this. One is this is a subject that had never been done before by the President's Cancer Panel in its history, a 40-year history. It is a subject of enormous public interest, particularly at the current time. And it's one that has had very little attention in recent years from the mainstream of cancer research. For example, the National Cancer Institute at that time was spending actually less than 15% of its funding on this subject. And the National Institute for Environmental Health Sciences, the major group that looks at environmental agents, was spending less than 30% of its budget, which is rather small, on the subject of cancer from environmental causes. And part of the reason for that is that most advocacy groups, of course, want cures. The public wants cures. And the causes of cancer are therefore rather underfunded and rather understudied. So we proceeded, and what an eye-opening experience that was. I can't tell you. It was, I started this venture with a number of assumptions that I think most people have. I assumed that when substances are regulated, that the regulations would be enforced. Well, this turns out not to be true. And another assumption is that things that are known to be cancer-causing agents would be regulated. Well, this is also not true. I'll give you an example. There was an agricultural health study done a few years ago that found that there were 30 pesticides in use that had been classified as human carcinogens or probable human carcinogens. And the problem is not just for agricultural workers. These pesticides end up in homes, in gardens, in food supplies, and in the water. In fact, they've been banned for landscaping use in Canada. So not all carcinogens are actually regulated. Of course, the most prominent example of that in recent years has been the herbicide Roundup, which has recently been declared carcinogenic. And so the last assumption was I always assumed that things would be tested for toxicity and for cancer-causing ability before they were put on the market. And this is clearly not true either. I think you'll hear more about this from Dr. Landrigan, but there are upwards of 80,000 chemicals in our environment and on our grocery shelves and our hardware store shelves. And very few of those have actually been tested for their cancer-causing ability. So this assumption is not true either. And you have to ask, why is that? And the answer is that in the United States, we use what is called the reactionary principle to chemical safety. And this means that we only regulate chemicals after they show evidence of harm. Now, this contrasts with the precautionary approach, which is used in most Western European countries and in Canada, which requires proof of safety prior to release. Very, very different approach. So in our country, there are hardly any incentives for developing safe chemicals. So we wrote in our report that 6% was likely to be a very serious underestimate for the impact of environmental causes of cancer, and that this was likely to be a much larger problem than anyone was willing to admit. Of course, that was an extremely unpopular conclusion at the time. But if I think what my life was like when I grew up versus what it is today, the differences are really striking. When I grew up, we didn't have an exterminator. We didn't use herbicides. We didn't have nonstick pans. There was not very much styrofoam. There were few beauty products. There were few commercial household cleaning products. And so you can't help but wonder, what is the impact of all of these chemicals on human health? Why have the incidence of childhood cancer and birth defects been increasing for the last 5 decades? Why is it that the onset of puberty has been occurring at a progressively younger age? Why is it that in the current epidemic of breast cancer, that more than 80% of women have absolutely no family history of the disease? Could these be related to the ocean of chemicals in which we now live? And with all these important questions needing to be answered, we have to ask, why isn't environmental carcinogenesis more prominent an issue in cancer research? And there are a lot of reasons. One is it's hard to study, it takes a long time to see the impact, and importantly, there's very little federal funding and almost none from industry to support research on this subject. Now, of course, the ultimate goal of studying environmental carcinogenesis is to prevent cancer, but cancer prevention is also an underappreciated and underfunded area of cancer research, which seems strange considering the potential impact it could have on reducing the burden of cancer. But cancer research today is mostly about cures. Obviously, both approaches are necessary. It is impossible to prevent all cancers, and all of us want better, less toxic treatments. But reducing the incidence of cancer should also be a priority. Preventing cancer has the potential to affect large numbers of people, including children, and has the added benefit of sparing them from the emotional, financial, and physical consequences of cancer treatment. And speaking of someone who has been cured of cancer by chemotherapy and surgery, I can tell you, all things considered, I would have preferred prevention. So why is prevention not a high priority? Well, change is hard. We like our automobiles, our plastic water bottles. It is contrary to many commercial interests, I'm sure you realize. Again, it takes a long time to see the results. But most importantly, cancer prevention has no face. And what I mean by that is that cancer treatment deals with real people. Patients and survivors have a voice and a face. It's personal. Treating someone with cancer is a partnership, and curing someone is a personal triumph. So cures are associated with very high motivation and a sense of urgency. Prevention, on the other hand, is not personal. It deals with populations rather than individuals. We don't know whose cancer was prevented, and it takes a long time, so there's not the same urgency about something that could happen in the distant future. But it is critically important. We need to be able to spare our children from the devastating consequences of a cancer diagnosis. You can help put a face on prevention by advocating for more emphasis on and more funding for prevention of childhood cancer. You can help by making prevention of cancer in children a priority in addition to finding cures. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kripke. The topic of prevention of childhood cancer and diseases on children can't be had without the next presenter. And much like Dr. Kripke, his true biography and bio sketch would probably take up the remainder of the time that we have. So let me just go through really quickly and then introduce our next presenter, Philip Landrigan. He's a pediatrician and epidemiologist who directs the Program for Global Public Health and the Common Good and the Global Observatory on Pollution and Health at Boston College. He's been involved in the issue of researching connections between the environment and human health for 4 decades. His background is tremendous in all of what he's done, and I'm not doing justice to it in the interest of trying to move things along. But needless to say, he's been involved on the President's Advisory Committee on Gulf War Veteran Illnesses. He served as senior advisor on children's health to the administrator of the U.S. EPA, where he was instrumental in launching EPA's Office of Children's Health Protection. He was in the Medical Corps. He served in the Medical Corps of the U.S. Navy from 1996 to 2005, obtaining the rank of captain. He's been involved in tracking the epidemiology of disease impact to first responders from 9/11 on the follow-up of 22,000 first responders. I mean, I could go on and on and on. We're very honored to have Dr. Landrigan address everybody today and take us through the issue of prevention and why it's so important, and build this foundation a little bit more. Dr. Landrigan.
Oh. Should I?
Phil, we're not able to hear you.
Yeah. Phil?
We can't hear you.
Sorry, I was on mute. Excuse me.
There we go.
Oh, thank you, Jonathan, for the nice introduction. Many thanks to CAC2 for having invited me to come speak to you this morning, and thank you, Dr. Kripke, for introducing the subject. Actually, I think the first time Dr. Kripke and I ever met was somewhere around 2005, give or take a year or two, when I testified as a witness before the President's Cancer Panel, and we've continued to go back and forth since that time, and it's an honor to be on the program with you this morning. So let's start with some numbers. Each year, more than 16,000 children in the U.S. are diagnosed with cancer, and cancer, as I'm sure many of you know, is the second leading cause of death in American children. Or another way to put it is it's the leading cause of death by disease. Only injuries and accidents cause more deaths in American kids. And the good news is contained in that slide that Jonathan showed you at the beginning of the webinar, that cancer deaths are down among American children because of treatments. This is truly one of the triumphs of modern medicine. I was a resident in pediatrics at Boston Children's Hospital, Harvard Medical School, from 1968 to 1970, and I spent time there on the Jimmy Fund ward, which was the name of the cancer ward. And no child with cancer survived, none. Some had longer remissions than others, but none survived. And today, of course, that's greatly different. It's one of the extraordinary triumphs of modern medicine. But the bad news is, as Jonathan intimated, is that the incidence of cancer, the number of cases per 1,000 children, is increasing, and also in young men, testicular cancer, which is really a delayed childhood cancer, is also increasing in incidence. And for those reasons, prevention is critical. And because we now know that the cancer process probably begins during the 9 months of pregnancy, the cancer prevention, the prevention of childhood cancer, has to begin during pregnancy and even before pregnancy, in terms of preventing chemical exposures to women who are going to become future mothers. And this is the same graph that Jonathan showed you with the decreasing death rate, but the increasing incidence rate. And the reason I'm repeating Jonathan's slide is just that this is so critically important. It's important that we all understand that there are two parts to childhood cancer. There's the cure, but there's also the prevention, and they're equally important. Here are some data from New York State, where I worked for many years, on actually putting numbers on these increases. So altogether, the increase in childhood cancer is 35% since the late 1970s, and that includes increases in leukemia, in lymphoma, and in cancers of the brain and central nervous system. All of those cancer types are up. So what are the causes? Well, some people have said maybe it's genetics, and certainly genetic susceptibility can affect a child's risk of cancer, but genetic factors simply cannot explain the increase in cancer that we've seen in this country over the past 40 or 50 years. Genetic change occurs on a much slower time frame, over centuries, not over decades. What about improved diagnosis? Well, that's probably a bit of the story, especially in the case of brain cancers. We have better imaging techniques. We can see malignancies today that we couldn't see a long time ago. But it certainly doesn't account for the increase in leukemia or for the increase in testicular cancer in young men, because the basic diagnostic tests for those cancers have not changed. We've gotten better at classifying them, and that classification guides treatment, but the basic diagnosis hasn't changed in 50 years for either one of those. Bad luck, I don't believe in bad luck. And so it comes down to environmental exposures. I believe firmly, and I think there's a lot of evidence to back up my belief, that environmental exposures in today's world, the chemicals, the plastics, the pesticides, the herbicides that Dr. Kripke mentioned, are collectively the most likely causes. And the work that we do, therefore, is focused on identifying the specific causes of cancer and then doing something about them. So here are some statistics here. Jonathan touched on this, that there are more than 80,000 chemicals in commerce. These are manufactured chemicals, synthetic chemicals, human-made chemicals, chemicals that didn't exist on planet Earth before about 40 or 50 years ago, but are now abundant in the environment. They're in practically every consumer product that you buy when you go to the market today has synthetic chemicals in it. These chemicals get loose, they get into the environment, they get into us and into our children. The CDC does rolling surveys across the United States every year, and they detect several hundred chemicals in the bodies of pretty much all Americans, and that includes newborn infants, it includes the breast milk of nursing mothers. And here's the kicker, here's the real issue, is that the great majority of these chemicals have never been tested for their safety. They've never been tested for their toxicity, exactly as Dr. Kripke said. You know, this is very different from drugs. Chemicals that are intended to be used to treat disease are extensively tested. They have to be shown to be safe. They have to be shown to be effective before they can come on the market. And the Food and Drug Administration regulates therapeutic chemicals very strictly. But by contrast, the chemicals that we call commercial chemicals or consumer chemicals that are in commercial products are basically presumed innocent until proven guilty. They're allowed to go into new products, they come out on the market, and nobody checks on their safety or their toxicity until disease or some other negative factor begins to appear. And chemical production is skyrocketing. This is a graph showing production from 1987 to 2020. The blue shaded area is the actual increase in production over that time, and you can just see that from year to year to year, the production of synthetic chemicals is going up. It's about a 3% growth in global production per year, which translates to a doubling in global production approximately every 25 or 30 years. One of the things we've learned over the years is that children are exquisitely sensitive to chemicals, much more sensitive than adults. And when I say children here, I mean children in the womb during the 9 months of pregnancy, infants, and little kids. And they're more sensitive for several reasons. First of all, they have greater exposure pound for pound to toxic chemicals than adults. For example, children breathe more air, they drink more water, they eat more food per pound of body weight, so they get more toxic chemicals into their body on a proportionate basis. Kids don't have the same ability as adults to break down toxic chemicals and get rid of them. And then thirdly, there's a huge vulnerability that comes along with being an unborn child or a small infant. We know, for example, from tragic episodes like the thalidomide disaster. Thalidomide was a drug manufactured in Europe. It was given to pregnant women to reduce morning sickness in pregnancy. It had no negative effect on the women, but 10,000 babies were born over the next couple of years with no arms and no legs, a condition called phocomelia, because their moms had taken this chemical during pregnancy. And that disaster and other similar disasters have made it painfully obvious to us that infants in the womb require special protection against toxic chemicals that would be basically harmless to an adult. And we summarize all that by saying that children are not little adults. They're really very different. So there's a growing body of evidence that toxic chemicals do in fact cause cancer in children. It's no longer just speculation or maybe, it's fact. And we know that toxic chemicals that get into a pregnant woman's body during her pregnancy cross over and get into the baby. The old belief that the placenta somehow protected the baby against toxic chemicals has been shown not to be true. So what chemicals, what environmental factors do we know can cause cancer with a high degree of certainty? Well, first of all, we know that X-rays, ionizing radiation, can cause cancer. We learned this with terrible clarity after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the atomic bombings, but it was also shown in landmark studies in the UK that X-rays during pregnancy produced increased risks of childhood leukemia. Then we had the DES episode in which women took diethylstilbestrol, a synthetic hormone, during pregnancy to prevent miscarriage. And 15, 20 years later, their female daughters were found to have an increased incidence of cancer of the vagina. There are hundreds of such women across the United States today. We know about UV light and skin cancer. We've learned that solvents like benzene can cause leukemia and lymphoma, and we've seen cases of those diseases in American children. Butadiene, which is a chemical that you've probably not heard of, most of you, it's a rubber chemical. There are cities in this country, especially in the Texas, Louisiana Gulf Coast, that produce butadiene for synthetic rubber, and that the chemical used to leak out of the factories and roll into the nearby schoolhouses, and we had epidemics of leukemia and lymphoma in those children. Pesticide exposure. Dr. Kripke mentioned the agricultural study. We now know that infants who are exposed in the womb to pesticides on farms have increased risk of leukemia. The herbicide glyphosate, known as Roundup, probably causes lymphoma. And then there are others. And most recently, we've got some very strong animal data, not human data yet, showing that aspartame, the artificial sweetener, is linked to leukemia and lymphoma, and that exposures during pregnancy are especially dangerous. There's also benefits. This is a two-way street. And we know, for example, that if a mom takes lots of folic acid during pregnancy, that will not only protect her baby against spina bifida and other birth defects, it'll also protect against childhood cancer And we know also that extended breastfeeding that goes for several months is quite effective in protecting children against cancer, probably because of immune factors that the mom transmits to her nursing infant. Beyond childhood, we know that exposes in early life to chemical carcinogens almost certainly push up the risk for cancer in adult life. And the way this works is that the toxic chemicals get into the infant or the child, set up processes in the cells which don't become full-blown cancers until many decades later. Cancer is a disease with a long incubation period, and childhood exposures matter. So it's one more reason to prevent children from coming into contact with toxic chemicals. I need to say a quick word about X-rays, even though I think it's a story that may be familiar to many of you, but X-rays to American children have increased drastically in the past 25 years, and the biggest component of that increase is from CAT scans, which deliver much more radiation than a standard so-called plain film. And of course, skin cancer, ultraviolet light. It's so important to emphasize and to re-emphasize the need to protect children against UV. I don't think anybody under the age of 80 should be allowed in a tanning parlor. A tanning parlor is just like a cancer machine. So this is what I think we need going forward for the future. We need a national cancer prevention plan. A bedrock of this plan would be an absolute requirement that chemicals that are designed for use by consumers, and especially chemicals that will come into contact with children, have to be proven safe. They have to be proven non-toxic before they come to market. It is simply not rational that we allow chemicals to come onto market without any testing. As Dr. Kripke said, we have the reactionary principle in this country where we don't do anything about chemicals until they've been shown to cause disease in children, and that is simply not right. It's just not right. We clearly need more research in this area, and that's where funding comes in. The fact that only a tiny fraction of the cancer budget goes into prevention research means that we simply don't have the money, we don't have the people, we don't have the energy going into discovering the preventable causes of cancer. We need to reform risk assessment in this country. Too much risk assessment in the agencies that set standards is based on protecting adults. Way too little goes towards protecting children, despite the fact that children are far more vulnerable. We have to act on what we know. And in essence, what I think we need to do in this country is open up a second front in the war on cancer. The first front, the gains that we've made in treating cancer have been extraordinary. There's still obviously much more to do, but the gains are incredible. And we don't want in any way to abandon that it's essential to keep up cancer treatments. But we need to complement the improved treatment of cancer with heightened prevention. And the good news is that when we do preventive studies, when we identify causes of disease in children, we know how to prevent. And the classic example is the story of lead in gasoline. So back in the 1970s and late 1970s, we were putting 100,000 tons of lead into gasoline in this country every year. And around that time, the science became very clear that the lead that was going into gasoline was coming out of cars, contaminating cities, causing lead poisoning in children, and causing loss of IQ and attention deficit disorder and other neurological problems in children. And the result was that EPA took lead out of gasoline beginning in 1975. And since that time, blood lead levels in American children have fallen by 95%. And there have been some additional benefits that we did not anticipate. We got rid of most lead poisoning except for lead paint poisoning, mostly inner city communities. And even beyond that, we had a 5-point gain in the average IQ of every child born in this country since 1980, which, for those of you who are as old as I am, is why your children and your grandchildren are smarter than you are. Every single child born since 1980 has 5 more IQ points than he or she would otherwise have had if they'd been exposed to lead. And that and that gain in IQ translates into improvements in the American economy, because these generations of more intelligent children are more creative, and they have greater earning capacity over their entire lifetime. And we've calculated that hundreds of billions of dollars have been put back into the American economy by these more intelligent lead-free children. And finally, we have very clear information now that the removal of lead from gasoline produced a sharp reduction in violent crime that began about 20 years after the lead removal took place, when those children grew up to become young adults. So it's very, very important to do the science, to act on the science, and prevent childhood cancer. Finally, for those of you who are on the call who might be involved in any way in the care of children as doctors, nurses, providers, it's important to remember that when you see a child with cancer, any child with cancer could have cancer that was caused by a toxic environmental exposure. There's no distinctive clinical picture of environmental cancer. It looks like any other cancer when you see a sick child. And the only way to learn about environmental exposures that might have caused a child's cancer is to sit with the child, sit with the parents, spend the time to ask about environmental exposures. It is the only way to make that discovery. Late Robert Miller, who is a distinguished pediatrician and epidemiologist at the National Cancer Institute, said that clinicians need to be alert. They need to keep their eyes and their ears open. They need to look for new connections. So, as I say thank you, I'll conclude with a quote by one of my teachers of preventive medicine, a man named William Fagey, who was one of the senior doctors at the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, where I worked for many years. Bill Fagey is the man who was in charge of the very successful global eradication of smallpox. And Bill said that no one is ever going to thank you for the disease that they did not get. And that's the fundamental problem that we, as Dr. Kripke said, in cancer prevention, there are no grateful patients. When a child is cured of cancer, the family is incredibly grateful because they've seen how bad the disease was and they've seen how wonderful the cure is. But who to thank when a child never gets cancer? And we have to use our brains, we have to use our intelligence, we have to understand that if we're going to prevent this continuing increase in the incidence of childhood cancer in the United States, if we're going to prevent the continuing pain and misery and heartbreak of childhood cancer, we've got to step up in a very serious way our efforts to prevent cancer. Thank you.
Dr. Landrigan, thank you so much for taking us through that. And it's a topic that obviously I know you could go on for a lot more time than we allotted to you. And Dr. Kripke, thank you for your presentation as well and for your talk. The scientific component of today, we actually wanted to give you a digestible amount of information, but it's really not the main focus of what we're going to really give to the community and hope that the community joins in on. And so as I introduce my next panelist here, we're going to answer questions at the end. I know we've got a question already, and talk about, as a community, what this initiative can involve, will involve, and should involve. But with that said, let me introduce Mary Beth Collins, who I've gotten to know a lot better over the last number of weeks. She is a tremendous advocate, has been in this community for over 21 years. Mary Beth's son was diagnosed in 1999 at the age of 1 with neuroblastoma. He's a survivor, but as we all know, labeling somebody as a survivor does not indeed give any indication as to what that child went through, experienced, what the family experienced, and what the child continues to experience. Mary Beth has provided a tremendous amount of information to the community through her communications. She's got 14 years of professional experience in nonprofit leadership and communications. Again, it's another bio that I could go on and on and on about. She has presented before the Pediatric Advisory Committee of the Food and Drug Administration, the ODAC committee, and she and her son has been invited to speak on long-term chemotherapy side effects, including the effects of significant hearing loss on maturing pediatric cancer survivors. Again, I can go on and on and on, but in the interests of time, I'm going to stop talking, and Mary Beth, here you go.
Good morning, all. What a privilege to be among this esteemed this morning and speaking with you. I'm going to keep my comments brief because there's a lot about this initiative that I want to leave time for you to learn more about. But I think as a parent who initially touched this topic at the middle of our house, actually had a contract that was submitted and accepted a contract when provisions were tested for alcohol, that the purchasers had researched on their own and actually somehow it learned that my son was diagnosed. They learned what type of cancer that he had and included it in our contract for the sale of our house. We put us front and center of everything that we're talking about today. And I, as a parent in the middle of treatment, still had to grapple with the possibility that the selection of my house was the reason why my son was diagnosed and he was going through that entire treatment. And that is a pain and emotion on anyone, except that, as we've already heard, more and more families will encounter it unless we start to deal with this head on. So you've already, most of you, if you know me, know that I've been on quite a soapbox about the survivorship aspects. And I think once we go through treatment, everything that we're doing in some perspective deals with prevention of and minimizing of the side effects. Phil Landrigan spoke about the CAT scans, which I think is a huge aspect of survivorship when parents are looking to those CAT scans to get comfort that the cancer hasn't come back or there aren't new developments. And we need to temper our fear of the checkpoints with cultivating environments to raise our children. And with us as parents being so emotionally struggling with the reality and with the fear, it's a tall order, but I think it's important for us to think through all of this and why this initiative is so important, not just for the population perspective that Margaret was talking about, but the real impact of day-to-day living that we as parents are nurturing for our kids. So on that, I'm going to pass it on to Ann Robertson.
Hi all, my name is Ann Reynolds Robertson. I'm on the board of MaxCure, as Jonathan mentioned. I'm also a founding board member of the Children's Environmental Health Center at Mount Sinai that Dr. Landrigan started over a decade ago to do the research and look into the environmental links to chronic illness, including cancer, and many of the other chronic illnesses that have skyrocketed in the last 30 to 40 years. I'm also soon to be, well, I've just recently launched my own nonprofit called A Toxic-Free Future for Our Children. Website will be up in about a month. But I had my first wake-up call only about 25 years ago. I was a fairly new mom with 3 young children. And it was then that I discovered just how many harmful substances and toxic substances in the everyday products that I was, my kids were playing with, they were sleeping on, and even the food they were eating. And that's what led me to probably, for the last 25 years, to be an advocate for children's environmental health, also to be a philanthropist, raise money for Dr. Landrigan's lab that was built at Mount Sinai to really help speed up the research on this end. also been an investor, and now, as I said, a nonprofit and a consulting firm that are helping to create a toxic-free future for our children. But it was 8 years ago that I was introduced to Richard Plotkin. Richard and I became dear friends. Took a little while, but this was probably an unlikely friendship. Now, you know, as we see with a politically charged and divided country, even more rare. I am a progressive Democrat. He was a conservative Republican. But despite those political differences, we both found that we had so much more in common. And mostly it was about the health and well-being of our children and grandchildren. Richard started the Max Muir Foundation, as many of you know, in CAC2 after his grandson was diagnosed with pediatric childhood cancer. When I first met Richard about 8 years ago, he was a bit reluctant initially to believe that there were environmental links to cancer. Spent years, I introduced Bill Andergan, and then it was 6 years later that he right. And shortly after that time that the Max Cure Foundation, myself, the American Sustainable Business Council, launched the Childhood Cancer Prevention Initiative. And soon, as you know, we'll be releasing the Childhood Cancer Report that's come out of this initiative. It's going to be released on September 23rd. And this report it's a multi-stakeholder approach to prevention that includes scientists and researchers like Bill and Dr. Kripke, health professionals, business leaders, policy experts, and children's environmental health advocates, all collaborating to better understand the scope of the problem, as well as the opportunities for action. This initiative also offers the opportunity for sustainable businesses that are created to solve the problem of toxic chemicals in our everyday products, and also to be recognized and rewarded in the marketplace. One of those companies happens to be the first business to sign on and be part of the Childhood Cancer Prevention Initiative, and that is a company called Naturepedic. Naturepedic is one of the first organic mattress companies. It was founded after shortly after the founder was tasked with buying a mattress for his first grandchild about 17 years ago. When he came back empty-handed, his wife said, "Why didn't you just, where's the mattress?" So that led him to build this company, because he felt it was so important for children to be in a healthy environment from the very beginning. So he's offering, and we're excited that he's the first, again, of other companies that will be doing a 20% during the month of Childhood or Pediatric Cancer Awareness Month, 20% discount on all their products, including organic masks, something that we can all use right now. And in addition, he's donating 5% to the Max Cure Foundation. So shortly there'll be a Max Cure will have an email address. So for anybody that's interested to learn more throughout the month, in addition to CAC2, we encourage you to send your email and interest to prevention@maxcure.org. And also these companies like Naturepedic, we're going to partner with them to raise for their customers to better understand and raise more awareness around the issues of childhood cancer, families, survivors, and of course how to prevent. So thank you, and Jonathan.
Thanks, Ann. I appreciate that. And, I know that when you talk about the initiative that this is, and you tell the story about Richard and how it came to pass, it really is one of the things that makes me smile the most about what we're doing and the background here. This topic is really huge, and we're going to run over a little bit in terms of timing on on the webinar, so apologize to everybody who has a hard stop at 12. I know Dr. Landrigan does, and you know, we're very appreciative of his time. Quickly, let me just say a few words, and then we've got a lot of questions that we're going to focus on and try and answer and try and move things forward quickly here. But you know, where does this all lead us as a community? And that's really where the focus is and where I want to direct people towards. This isn't a Max Cure initiative. It's a childhood cancer community initiative. It's much larger, and CAC2 is an amazing example of an umbrella organization that can bring so many different people together and make things happen. And we as a community have made so much happen over the last number of years with such immense pieces of legislation, groundbreaking legislation, the Creating Hope Act, the STAR Act, the Race for Children Act, the Gabrielle Miller Kids First. I mean, it's just on and on and on. This is a community that once motivated can move mountains. And that's what this is. This is a mountain. But as I said, it's a spoke on the wheel, and it needs to be brought out of the shadows. It's not a political issue. It's not a partisan issue. It's not a Max Cure issue. And I don't want any organizations to feel as though it is just one foundation's push. This is all of us together, and we need everybody on board that wants to lend their voice. And you know, in the coming days and weeks, I'm hoping that after this webinar, we can all gather together on a conference call and discuss the next components of this initiative. With that said, let's answer some questions now and move those forward, and then I'll wrap things up and tell everybody how they can join.
Thank you very much, everybody. This has been a really enlightening and important webinar. We do have a lot of questions, and I understand that our panelists are not able to stay beyond the top of the hour. We had this happen at the annual summit, and we invited Doug Hawkins to get with us the following week and just record some Q&A, and I don't know whether Dr. Landrigan or Dr. Kripke would be able to do that if we don't get to all the questions, as opposed to, you know, giving written answers. There is a pair of questions, one from Lauren Aday and one from Tammy Bristol, who are kind of interested in how vaccines might fit into this, the toxicities and so forth, and that most vaccines are deemed harmless, but there's a question about maybe the current schedule with so many doses so quickly together that children are having. Is there anything that you guys would like to say about vaccines related to the initiative?
Hey, this is Dr. Landrigan. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. So what I'll say about vaccines is that they are probably the single most important preventive measure in pediatrics today. I'm old enough that I can remember smallpox and measles and polio. These were dread diseases which are no longer with us thanks to vaccines. I know a lot of younger parents are concerned about vaccines. They've read a lot of stuff on the internet about vaccines causing cancer, vaccines causing autism. I have very, very carefully reviewed this literature, and I find no evidence whatsoever that vaccines cause autism. I find no evidence whatsoever that vaccines cause cancer. And in fact, there are two vaccines out there that prevent cancer. The vaccine against hepatitis B, which has become increasingly widespread, protects against liver cancer, and the vaccine against the human papillomavirus, HPV, protects against cervical cancer and oral cancer. So, and I know some parents want to slow down vaccines, want to moderate the schedule. My response to that is to say, when you slow down the schedule of vaccines, you leave your children unprotected. You wouldn't want to leave your children unprotected against cancer. you should also not leave them unprotected against the infectious diseases.
Thank you. Dr. Landrigan, before you have to go, there's another question that I think that you may be really able to answer, and this is from Bob Panuski at the People Against Childhood Cancer. Considering that we mostly all agree that exposure to carcinogens is a cause of childhood cancer, can you comment on the continuum of risk from A, exposure to the public from consumer products versus B, hazardous waste sites, and just comment on maybe the value of each, like dollars per life year saved or that sort of thing. Should we be concentrating on consumer products or hazardous waste sites or some other big piece of it?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, because preventive resources are always finite. We have to make choices, and we have to go after the most important hazards. Hazardous waste sites are certainly an issue, but actually we've done a pretty good job in this country of controlling at least our worst hazardous waste sites. And we clearly have to continue that effort through the Superfund program. One of the big gifts that was given to the chemical manufacturing industry a few years ago by the Congress was relieving the chemical industry of having to pay for the cleanup of the hazardous waste sites that they create. So the burden of waste site cleanup now falls on all of us, the taxpayers. And I'm in hopes that a new Congress in 2021 can put the burden back on the people who created the mess in the first place. That's not a political comment, that's just a statement of reality. I think that the biggest unmet need right now is consumer products. There's almost no regulation whatsoever of toxic chemicals coming into consumer products, and we urgently need legislation in this country, enforceable legislation that requires that chemicals be tested before they come into the market. I mean, at the present time, we're using our children as the experimental animals, and that is simply not right.
Thank you, Dr. Landrigan. The following question is from one of our newer CAC2 members. This is Simon Strong from the Oliver Foundation, and he really wanted to pass on his appreciation for this webinar, and note that his foundation focuses solely on pediatric cancer prevention and its environmental causes, and is working with a partnership through the Baylor College of Medicine and the Reason Why Us study. What initiatives can CAC2 take to reverse the perspective that the greatest challenge for families is really just getting through treatment, and that it's just bad luck and the fault of the genes? So is there something that CAC2 can be doing, and a follow-up, how can the medical community in particular work with us to help families understand the role of the environment? And so, that's like a softball for this team, but can you talk a little bit about how we can get together and work on this, and just be more transparent in general about the effect, not just on getting cancer, but also on the effect of incidence rates and chronic health conditions for our survivors as well.
So, Mary Beth, I just want to say something really quick, and then I have a kind of follow-up question that lands into a question that I wanted to ask you as well about this. But I wanted to say to Simon, thank you for the question. And last week, he and I had a very long conversation about the issue of prevention, and he shared with me the work that his foundation is involved in, and it's very impressive. And the reason why .us is a study that is recruiting childhood cancer families to collect information and try and analyze, to the extent possible, the epidemiological issues with the diagnosis of a child. And I think to date they've got 500 families that have signed up, and I'm very much looking forward to having additional conversations with Simon and getting them involved and getting Simon involved in this initiative. But in terms of what we can do through CAC2, this webinar is there's been talk about the issue of prevention before, and I've had conversations with Vicki and other members at summits and meetings over the past number of years about the issue of prevention. It hasn't come out of the shadows though, and I'm hopeful that through this webinar, through the release and launch of the white paper as Ann shared, and through the coming weeks, that this is going to be the beginning of this movement to bring the issue of prevention out of the shadows and into a greater focus within the community and within CAC2, and then create a more focused interest group to look at what asks we need to bring forward on the legislative end of things, to look towards what we can do with respect to raising the awareness in the medical community, the clinical community, so that upon diagnosis, clinicians are advising and counseling their patients, parents, or caregivers to provide their data information to the Reason Why study. There's so much that we can do, and that's what I'm hoping grows from this webinar. And one of the questions that I was cued to ask Mary Beth was about the community and how we can, as a community, move forward and what nonprofits can do. But I also cut you off before I started answering this question. So, Mary Beth, I'm curious to hear from you.
Well, I think to try to summarize it, I think the information that we have is probably the best place to start. This information on this ending slide. Let us know, give us an email, or you can even call if you'd like to discuss it further with us, that you're interested in connecting with us, that you're interested in learning more, and that you would like to get involved. As you just mentioned, Jonathan, I mean, we'll have more information, so we'll be sending information out very quickly for those who want to get put on that mailing list. But with Childhood Cancer Awareness Month right around the corner, it's an opportune time to be able to start to create that spotlight. And we will have information that you can share with others to help raise awareness. One thing that I'm so proud to be a part of so many of you here in the childhood cancer community, because we do this exceptionally well. We take important nuggets of information and we know how to share it. We know how to increase the volume in the megaphone really, really well to command attention. And for those that need to hear the messages, we get their attention and we get to have great conversations about these really important issues. And this is the next really important issue that we need to rally together to be able to make sure that the messages are heard and that the people that can create effective change can do so. So it all starts with an email or a phone call so we can start to build our battalion.
Thank you, Mary Beth.
So I think the last question that's in the chat box has to do with the EPA and whether that there have been some cutbacks at the EPA and at other regulatory agencies, and what is the panel's thinking about the impact on those particular decisions?
Well, I think that those cutbacks are causing disease and death, frankly. I hate to call the EPA a regulatory agency. It's basically a public health agency. EPA's job is to protect the health of the public against toxic chemicals in the environment. The chemical industry has tried to portray it as a regulatory agency and then have tried to argue that because it regulates people and infringes upon the industry's freedom, it's somehow bad. But in fact, what the EPA does through regulating chemicals is protect children's health. And we know that levels of chemical pollution and air pollution are going up in this country in the last few years, and we have tracked the impact of that increased pollution on human health. And more people are dying now than were dying 5 years ago from air pollution and chemical pollution, and that's just not right. So I'm in hopes that that the public health agencies in this country, the CDC, the National Institutes of Health, the EPA, will all get more funding in the years ahead. You get what you pay for, and if you don't invest in those agencies, people suffer.
So I think that's, we have one additional question that came in through my email instead of through the chat box. And it really has to do with what, this may be for our CAC2 members. Parents of children with cancer may not, the question is asked this way, that no parent wants to have been the cause of their child's cancer. And so is there a way to think about what this group is trying to do in this initiative that will not put the blame on parents for not being vigilant in protecting their kids from toxic waste sites or consumer chemicals or whatever? I think that this is a hard question, but it is one that so many of us who have walked through the cancer world with our children have on our minds.
This is such a painful question. Mary Beth, I want to share my thoughts too, but as a parent of a survivor.
Well, my initial thought is there are multiple facets on this issue. So yes, what I endured was more of a cause fear. But what I'm looking for parents of those in treatment and those of survivors is the empowerment that so much of this information is going to be able to give parents. Some of the initiative partners that we're trying to make arrangements to offer discounts to our families relates to organic masks, relates to environmental toxin-free disinfectants. I mean, right now in COVID, that's all that we're thinking about and we're living and breathing every day is through our masks and disinfecting everything around us. But, you know, we all also sit and wonder, what does, you know, months of breathing in Lysol every day do to a person, especially an exceptionally vulnerable person like a child who's already gone through cancer treatment and possibly enduring multiple side effects. So to nurture a much more healthy environment is empowerment every day that we can give to our families to actually minimize the symptoms that they are experiencing and possibly even reducing secondary cancers, which I think is a very critical component of what we're talking about here in the childhood cancer community.
Okay, that's a very helpful answer. Jonathan, you have something else?
Yeah, I do. I know Anne has a comment, and then I want to make a comment to that as well. And then I guess if nothing else, we can wrap.
There's a great story. It's a good news story. There's about a year ago, I was invited to a fundraiser in Bentonville, Arkansas, for what turned out to be a child care center. I was not aware of even what the fundraiser was for until I got there. So what I found was, this is named after the matriarch of Walmart. Now, you know, some good, some bad, but anyway. So this child care center called the Helen R. Walton Center for Childhood Enrichment. She's been a big child advocate her whole life. Built a center, you know, during her lifetime, actually to spare Walmart parts. So anyway, years later, decades later, when they decided they wanted to build a new facility, they had hired local architectural firm, construction company, about to break ground. 2 children were diagnosed with pediatric cancer at the exact same time. So what happened was both parents, for different reasons, had their genetics tested, came back that they were not genetic carriers, but it was actually an environmental. The director was very close to one. She started to do the research. She realized that there were potentially carcinogenic chemicals in the building materials and other products that they were using. She shifted everything, found the healthiest, environmentally healthiest architectural firm, and they have right now probably the healthiest child care facility in the country, very aware of all of these risks. So the good news, it's not easy. Now, of course, it's Walmart, but there are simple things like Mary Beth said, we can disinfectants and other products that are on the marketplace that can reduce the risks of cancer and then secondary diagnosis of cancer.
One final question, a comment to that last question with respect to parents feeling as though they are the cause of their child's cancer, and from the emotional standpoint, this initiative, as Mary Beth said, is not about causing stigma. It's not about causing further pain. It's not about causing parents and families to second guess any of their decisions at any point in time. I can't imagine that any parent or caregiver would willingly or knowingly do anything to quote unquote cause their child to have cancer. It's unfathomable. People will always second guess themselves. It's human nature. And every time I counsel another family whose child was just diagnosed with DIPG, the type of brain tumor my daughter had, and they share with me one major concern that, if they choose treatment A over treatment B, the what ifs and the second guessing and the horror that they may feel in the end. What I tell them is whatever you choose is right for your child. And I've talked to families who have chosen not to do anything, including radiation, and that was the right choice for their child. This is about empowerment. This is not about making people feel bad. This is not about being political. This is not about creating an initiative that is attacking anybody. It's not about putting businesses out of business. It's not about pointing fingers at corporate America. It's about trying to find a way to raise our voice as a community and address the issue and bring the issue front and center in the legislature, with the clinical and research community, with the advocacy community, and having a conversation that creates change. And that's something that this community does very, very well, is creates change and gets together and addresses and tackles issues. It's not a Max Cure initiative, it's a community initiative. And looking at the white paper and the list of organizations involved, it's a cross-sector and cross-community initiative that hopefully starts with all of us saying that, yeah, it's time to bring this conversation front and center in the same way that we talk about cure and talk about creating survivorship in children who are diagnosed. Mary Beth shared how you can get involved in the coming days and weeks. I'm hoping that we hear many voices coming together and that the conversation continues through CAC2, because I think CAC2 is a phenomenal vehicle to utilize to continue to raise our voices together as an honest broker. And Vicki, thank you for everything you do. Dr. Kripke, thank you so much for your time. And Mary Beth, you guys are incredible. And thank you so much. Thank you to everybody for joining us.
So two brief reminders, or maybe more than two. One, Jonathan and Mary Beth have both written blog entries that are on the CAC2 website under the news tab, which is where you'll find a recording of this webinar as soon as we get it processed. Please be on the lookout for the white paper that's coming out in September. And everybody who's still on the phone, there's still time to get registered to attend the Family Support and Survivorship Summer Series meeting a week from tomorrow at noon. And if you have trouble figuring out how to get that done, just let me know and I'll get you set up. Thanks so much for hanging on for a long time. This was important, and I'll see y'all soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.